While dynamic routing is convenient, under certain conditions, routing protocols can generate a very large amount of traffic that can have a negative impact on your network performance. And one alternative is to use static routes instead of dynamic routing protocols. Static routes have no overhead on the router CPU, they use no bandwidth between routers, and there is the added security benefit since only administrators can add routes to the network. Now that's all about the upside to using static routes. There's also a downside. If there's a change to your network, you, the administrator, must go around to each router and you must manually fix the routing table on all those routers. On a small network where you have 1 or 2 routers, 3 routers, that's fine. On a large enterprise where you have a lot of routers, that's not even conceivable. You'd have to use dynamic protocols. In our last video, we talked about static routes and their usage, and we're going to take a look at another type of static route now, known as the default route or the gateway of last resort. Notice here that on my router, and I currently have focus on Tampa, that we do have a gateway of last resort set, and I'm pointing over to that interface over in New York that points to the serial 2 that basically says that, listen, if you guys in Tampa can't resolve my request, send my request to the default gateway or the gateway of last resort, the default route, and ask it. That happens to be the interface of serial 2 on the New York router. Notice that I still have my entries from my last video in here. Those are all static entries, and they point over to all the different parts of my network. Now, in lieu of that, in lieu of these static entries, I could have just used a default gateway, a default route, and I could have basically told my Tampa router, hey look, if you can't find it here, go here. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. Now, how do I clear out these static entries that I no longer need? 2 different ways. You can use the clear command. Let's use context sensitive help. And I want to clear what? Well, I want to clear out some IP addresses. So let's just type in IP question mark. Where are these IP addresses located? Well, they're up inside my routing table. So let's add route. Now, the last thing it wants is either an asterisk for everything, or I can type in 1 static entry at a time and take it out. That's one way of doing this. Now, another way is for me to go up inside the global configuration mode and just say no. No IP route. What's the address? 0.0.0.0. Subnet mask of 0.0.0.0. Hit enter. Now it took it, so if I do a Control Z and I go back out, and I'm going to just type in show IP route again. Now I notice that my gateway of last resort is not set. Okay, so let's go back up one more time, and we're going to see how we set the gateway of last resort or my default route. Okay. Again, I have to be in the global configuration mode. That's great. Type in IP route. Now the address 0.0.0.0. 0.0.0.0. Now, there's a rule that says that you cannot have an entry in the routing table of all zeros. And since nobody can find the IP address they're looking for, if I have a default route that is configured with all zeros, that is where they're going to be sent to. That's the whole idea. So I'm going to type in the interface that I want to use as my gateway of last resort, and that's on the New York router. So type in 204.10.20.2. Hit enter. It took it. Let's do a Control Z. Now let's do another show IP route. And there my gateway of last resort is back. But remember, it's redundant for me to have these static routes when I have a stub network and I'm using a default route. Doesn't make sense. Now another usage might be that of an IP. I see that my stub network is basically the router that allows everybody else in my network to have access to the internet. So up on my New York router, I would configure it with the default gateway. And it would be telling everybody else on the network that, hey, listen, if we can't resolve it here, we're going to go to Tampa and we're going to send our request over to it. Notice that Tampa has a static route that points back to New York so that it can resolve anything that is local to its network. Now, you can think of it as also being like ICS. Another form of this would be ICS, Internet Connection Sharing. We basically have an ICS host that is connected to the Internet provider by either a dedicated line or a modem, and we have our ICS clients. In this case, we have two of them. They just look at that ICS host as nothing more than a default gateway. A very simple router, but still, nonetheless, a router. Okay. So pretty much that's all there is to configuring the default gateway or the default route and the gateway of last resort. So we're going to continue on in this series, and in our next two videos we're going to be looking at a null zero interface and floating static routes, and we're going to look at and see how we use and configure those in our routed network.